Welcome to this event in the 2020 Portobello Book Festival. My name is May Shaw and I'm a member of the organising group. The festival is organised annually by a local group of enthusiastic readers and writers in conjunction with and in support of the local public library. Books featured can be found at the Portobello Bookshop. I would like to thank today's contributors for their willingness to participate in this reconfigured festival. Thank you for joining us and we hope you enjoy it.
Very pleased to be joined by Anne Stormont today. Anne is a retired teacher, author of 4 novels for adults. One is The Change of Life, and then there's her trilogy, which is Displacement, Settlement, and her more recent book, Fulfilment. She also has written a children's novel called The Silver Locket, which we'll speak about later on. So thank you very much, Anne, for agreeing to talk with me today. I'd like to start off, if I can, by asking you to tell me a little bit about your latest novel, Fulfilment.
Well, Fulfilment is, as you mentioned, it's the third one in a trilogy set on the Isle of Skye, where I used to live, lived for many years. And it brings that series to an end. It started with Displacement, went on to Settlement, and Fulfilment is the final instalment of the story. The story being about Jack and Rachel, the 2 main characters, and that goes through all 3 novels. But I'm now leaving them in peace.
So, as you say, that is a series. Change of Life was a standalone book.
Yes.
When you started writing Displacement, did you always know you were going to be writing a series, or could you just not let the characters go?
Yeah, the second of those. I thought Displacement was just a standalone as well. I'd never really thought about writing a series, and I thought I'd sort of brought things to a close, which I had. I mean, you could read Displacement and be, well, I would hope, quite happy that things have been resolved and we've got to an ending that is satisfactory. But it was one of those things that started to niggle. I was thinking about my next book, and these 2 characters, Jack and Rachel, wouldn't sort of leave me alone, and I couldn't decide, and I thought, is there enough there for another story, and where could we go with it? So I did a little poll on my author page on Facebook of followers, of readers of the books, and I said, here's the choice: completely new, standalone, or will I write a second part to Displacement? And it was overwhelmingly, a second part. So I thought, oh, well, right, I want to keep the readers on side. So I wrote the second one, and then as I was writing it, I thought, there's so much here that I still want to say. I thought, there's going to be a third one. But now definitely feel that it's time, definitely, as I say, just to leave these characters in peace and to move on. But I feel the story now has come to its conclusion. So, yes.
It's always a good sign. Always a good sign if your readers want to know more about your characters, isn't it?
Absolutely.
About what happened to them. And I have just finished reading the novel last week, which I really enjoyed. And obviously I won't say anything about it, but yeah, I did find it a very fulfilling read. Yeah. So I think you're probably right. You can leave them in peace now, or you never know, they might kind of talk to you again.
Yeah, I've flirted with the notion of a short story set around Christmas a couple of years later or something like that as a sort of bonus story, but finding the time to actually do it will be the thing.
So you said that the characters were kind of niggling at you, and I know a lot of authors say that their characters talk to them as they're writing. And have you ever kind of rewritten anything that you'd planned for Rachel and Jack? Did you think it was going one way and then it went?
Yes, it was particularly with Jack in the first book, in Displacement. I thought I had, his story sort of all planned out and everything, and he was really quite assertive, and it'd be like I'd hear his voice in my head, and telling me, no, I wouldn't have done that, or I wouldn't have said that, or I wouldn't have gone there. And I had to at one point stop and actually, sounds mad, but I actually interviewed him. I had some questions for him, and it's amazing what your brain can actually do, the way it can compartmentalize like that. And I got some answers that way. And then at other points when you're writing, the characters will really surprise you. a conversation will start between the two of them, and it'll be like, where's this going? And it's almost like, you know, as the author, you're not in complete control. It's a really strange thing that the characters become real, and at the end of a book, I miss them, you know, not being with them every day when I've finished writing it. And because it was set in Skye and I was living on Skye, it was that mad thing of thinking that I might see them. I might see them when I was out and about, and I really had to have a word with myself and to preserve my sanity. But they become very, very real and separate from you as an author. Yeah, weird, really weird.
I know you've said before that you write about characters who are older but not necessarily wiser,
Yes.
and I think that's definitely the case with Jack and Rachel. There were certain times, particularly in the last book, it's like, oh, for goodness sake, you two, could you just talk to each other and you know, sort things out? But setting aside Jack and Rachel, who are obviously the most important characters in that book, or that set of books, I should say, are there any other characters that you've written about who really stand out for you? I suppose it's like saying, have you got a favourite child? But is there one that really stands out?
I really liked and admired Rosie in my first book, in A Change of Life, because she had to face up to some difficult stuff. And it was partly autobiographical in that I, like Rosie, had cancer, although it was a different cancer. It's breast cancer in Rosie's story in Change of Life. But so some of that was my own experience, but I really admired how independent she was and how she held things together. So yes, I was fond of her. Also really like Alistair in the Skye series of novels. He's Jack's friend, and on Skye they just meet when Jack moves to Skye when he has retired as a police officer. And Alistair becomes his friend, and he's quite he just says what he thinks, and he's very good at getting Jack to face up to things and to, I suppose, man up and face the issues and do something about it and stop fooling himself and kidding himself. And so I've got a real soft spot for Alistair as a friend. I think he'd be a good friend to have.
Yes, I think he would. Do you think you could read a bit for us, please, from your recent book, from Fulfilment?
Yes.
Get a flavour of your writing and what's happening in this particular book. I should say you mentioned that Displacement, when you wrote it, it was intended to be just a one-off book.
Yes.
And although this is the third in a trilogy, I personally feel that they are books you could read as a standalone. Yes. Because you do cover enough of the backstory that people would understand. Obviously, I would recommend that people read all three, but you know, if you wanted to dive straight into Fulfilment, you could do that, and you would still have an idea of what happened.
People have done that, and they, you know, have said that it was, because I've checked, you know, was it okay that, you know, you hadn't read the first two, and they said yes. It's quite a knack to not put in too much backstory, because for people that have read the other ones, then that would be very dull, because like, yeah, we know that. So, but yes, and I hope you get an idea. I'm just going to read chapter 1. So hopefully people will get an idea that, yes, you can get straight into the story, even although there's backstory involved. It shouldn't affect your enjoyment or understanding. So this is from Fulfilment. It's chapter 1. It's two narrators. Jack narrates the first bit, and then it switches to Rachel narrating the second bit, but I'll let you know who's speaking. So chapter 1 begins with Jack talking. I was standing so close to the cliff edge. It was a cold March morning on the Scottish island of Skye's western headland. The strengthening wind pushed against me as if it was urging me forward, closer and closer to the abyss below. The waves rushed in and broke against the rocks, a turmoil that matched the state of my mind. I had to force myself to step back, force myself away and back to the path, catching my breath against the wind. I thought that the walk would be the perfect preparation for seeing Rachel later. I thought it would help clear my head and reinforce for me that the decision I'd made was positive and right for us both. But my demons had tagged along too. In the end, I always screwed up. At 58 years old, I was no wiser than I was at 18 when it came to making a success of things. My decision to move on wasn't positive, it was a cop-out. It was me reacting to not getting my own way. It was just another example in the long list of my failings. I'd failed to be faithful to my ex-wife, I'd failed to protect the life of my police colleague, and now I was failing Rachel. And to top it all, my temporary post-retirement return to work as a police consultant 10 months previously had not ended well when I failed to prevent myself being kidnapped, tortured and shot by a notorious Edinburgh criminal. As a textbook example of psychological torture, Tommy Gray, the leader of an Edinburgh gang of drug traffickers and people smugglers who I'd spent years chasing while I'd been a police detective in the city, would have scored A+ for how well he did the job on me. He delivered the perfect combination of types of injury by simultaneously inflicting extreme physical pain along with unbearable mental anguish. He'd intended to kill me, but it appeared he'd also factored in the possibility he'd fail. His perfectly planned and executed methods ensured that the excruciating legacy of his actions would manifest as post-traumatic stress disorder. So even although I was rescued and he was shot and killed by my police colleagues, his work on his vengeful goal of destroying me continued. Not only that, he did the job so well that whenever my mind replayed what he'd done, the mental and physical aspects continued to be perfectly synchronized, causing me the maximum agony. PTSD meant there seemed to be no end to my time held captive in that filthy, crumbling, isolated building. I was forced to relive the kicks and punches to my head and body, the burns to my flesh and the struggle to breathe after being held face down in a dirty sink full of water. I was also forced to relive Gray's taunts about my failings as a man, as a police officer, and as a human being in general. He'd done his research and he knew exactly what to go for regarding my failings and vulnerabilities. Most chilling and terrifying of all were the threats he'd made to my loved ones, including Rachel. Of course, I'd been especially vulnerable to Gray's tactics, as all he had to do was build on my pre-existing mental health issues. By the time he got hold of me, I was already suffering from panic attacks and some PTSD-type symptoms that had begun to make themselves felt a few months before he kidnapped me. They were the result of the long-buried emotional aftermath of the shooting of a police colleague, Mike McRae, a fellow detective and a friend, was shot and killed during an undercover operation I was in charge of. The killer was Gray's gangster father, also shot dead at the scene. Afterwards, I successfully buried the trauma and the guilt I'd been left with, but they resurfaced more than 5 years later, after I'd taken early retirement from the police and moved to Skye, and just months before Gray kidnapped me. But since Gray, my symptoms have become much more intense. Sometimes it would be a daytime flashback, but worse by far were the nightmares and horrific waking dreams. The former would leave me panicking, sweating, and fighting to breathe, but the latter did all that and more. I lost count of the nights I had to leave my bed, chilled by sweat, shaking and whimpering with fear as I headed for the bathroom and struggled, often unsuccessfully, not to throw up. So yes, it probably wasn't surprising. My beleaguered brain was having some less than positive thoughts as I stood there that morning on the cliff. Maybe I wouldn't ever recover from the post-traumatic stress. Maybe I didn't deserve to. Maybe it would have been better if Tommy Gray had killed me. But I was sure of 3 things. 1, I loved Rachel. I had loved her from the moment we met here on the island, just over 2 years earlier. She was beautiful, strong and brave. She was equally at home looking after the animals on her croft as she was at her desk as a writer and illustrator, and I'd never known anyone like her. I loved her so much that I wouldn't be able to bear it if I let her down, or if my now weak and needy state prevented her from fulfilling her dreams. I dreaded holding her back, like her ex had done for so long. She deserved so much better than that. 2, if I was going to get well, I needed to concentrate my emotional energy on that. I would have little left for Rachel, and again, she deserved more. And 3, Even if I could get back to being the man I once was, instead of the damaged mess I'd become, I couldn't stick to the settlement we'd recently reached as regarded our relationship. If I got back to being the man I was before, I'd want more. I'd want us to be married, and Rachel had made it clear that wasn't going to happen. She wanted our relationship to continue, but she also wanted her independence, and she deserved that too. I don't know how long I stood there tussling with myself, but in the end, I knew it had to be done. No matter whether my motivation was unselfish and loving, or whether it was me taking the easy way out by focusing on my own recovery, my decision had to stand. Rachel would be a whole lot better without me. And then Rachel takes over the narrative for the final little bit of the chapter. It was almost 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Jack was now over an hour late and he wasn't answering his phone. A mixture of fear and dread made my stomach churn as all sorts of what-ifs played out in my imagination. I'd begun that day in late March feeling excited about seeing him after our 2 weeks apart while I'd been away in Glasgow. However, my excitement probably blinded me to the reality of how things were between Jack and me, and I know I probably should have seen the crisis coming. I should have acted much sooner than I did to avert it. After all, I knew deep down that all was not well with Jack or with our relationship. I shouldn't have delayed the honest conversation we needed to have. But I'd been so focused on my work that I chose, at least in the short term, to ignore the signs. Yes, Jack had engaged with all the treatment he'd been offered and was still undergoing since the terrible events of last year, and in some respects he'd made progress, but this was mostly physical. Mentally and emotionally, he remained vulnerable. And yes, he got slightly better at opening up to me about how he was truly feeling, but it still didn't come easily to him. After all, until relatively recently, he'd seen himself as strong, calm, and protective, both in his former long career as a police detective and as a man. But now his feeling of invincibility had been taken from him, and for him to admit he was human like the rest of us was difficult. So he needed me to be there for him, and not only on a part-time basis. He needed me to make time for him and encourage him to talk. In short, he needed more of a commitment from me. But being stuck in an unhappy marriage for almost 30 years had made me wary of a full-on partnership. Therefore, it had been me who wanted to keep our 2-year-old relationship on an informal footing. It had been me who wanted us to continue as friends and lovers, but not move in together. However, I'd been kidding myself Jack was all right with that, and I'd recently realised our relationship wasn't fulfilling for either of us. So yes, I needed to talk to him, to assure him that I'd be there for him whenever he needed me, just as he had been for me, and that I was willing to make changes in order to do that. And I planned to tell him that over lunch at my place, if he showed up. I knew he'd planned to drive over to Waterstein that morning and then to walk to the cliffs at Neast Point. He said he wanted to take some photos. It was a beautiful, wild location, but it was isolated and the mobile phone signal was patchy at best. Usually I found comfort when looking at Skye's incredible landscape. It was the place where I was born and raised, and having spent my married life in Edinburgh, I'd returned to live on the island 7 years previously after my divorce. Not only that, I now lived in Burnside, the house I grew up in. But there was little comfort to be found that day as I stared out of the living room window, and I had to tell myself not to panic. I looked beyond the sheep grazing on the croft and gazed at the loch. Its surface reflected the grey March sky. Heavy, sleety rain hit the window as I watched the mist advancing in from the Minch, the stretch of water that lies between the island of Skye and the outer Hebrides. I didn't think it would be long before my view of the sea and the snow-capped mountains beyond was obscured. The wind was getting up too, and there had been storm warnings issued of it reaching gale force by early afternoon. I could only hope Jack had been aware of the forecast when he set off. I could only hope he was okay and wasn't lying injured or unwell and able to get help. And I could only hope that if he was safe and well, then his lateness wasn't because he didn't want to see me. And that's the end of chapter 1.
Thank you very much. I think that gives us a real flavour of your writing. Hopefully will intrigue people. And I think it really shows something which I find in these books is that you really get inside the head of these characters.
Yeah,
you know, you really get to know what both Jack and Rachel are
Yes.
thinking, and I think
Well,
that's a real strength of the writing.
Thank you.
Now, you've that part that you read is set on Skye, where you said you've lived as well, and settings are really a strong part of your writing, I feel. In this set of books, there's Skye, there's Edinburgh, there's Israel and Palestine as well in the middle book. Oh, and this one as well, actually.
Yes.
There is a little trip, isn't there, in this one too?
Yes.
So I just wondered, you know, how important is setting to you, and why are those places chosen?
Again, that's a very good question. I mean, Skye for the three books was obviously largely influenced by the fact it was where I was living, and it is such a spectacular setting. I mean, the island is, there is no other word for it, is spectacular. And so it lends it, if you want drama and you want an ever-changing sort of, you know, ever-changing weather and all that, so you can have moods changing with the weather. You can have a sort of level of excitement that's added to by all that background, as it were. People can go for long walks and be relatively isolated if they need to be, and all that kind of thing. So, and just Skye's very, very close to my heart, and I wanted to write about it, although the little township that Rachel and Jack live in is fictional. It is, I set it on the Waternish Peninsula, which isn't fictional, and I had a very clear idea of exactly where on the Waternish Peninsula Hallidale, the fictional little township, is. But so that was where the Skye setting came from. Both characters had to go to the city occasionally to do things. Sometimes it might be to Inverness, sometimes it might be to Glasgow, sometimes it might be, in Jack's case, it was usually Edinburgh, because that's where all the drama took place for him, and it's where his daughter lives, and so on. So, you know, again, and again, the Scottish cities are great settings. You only have to think of all the crime writers that use them. Are great settings for pieces of action in a story. The Middle East connection is, again, a personal one. I've been to the country of Israel, Palestine several times. I first visited when I was 19, and I visited, my most recent one was 3 years ago. I have a very dear friend from school days who is Israeli and lives there. So that was the original connection with the country. We kept in touch when we'd been at school together, and then when she went home, we kept in touch. And she's very politically active and pro-Palestinian, which for an Israeli is quite a tricky position to be in. But she's her and her husband are very committed to a peaceful solution for everybody, Israelis and Palestinians. And Rachel had a Jewish heritage that she'd never really got to grips with. She'd been brought up in Scotland. Her mother was a Jewish refugee from Germany, a wartime child refugee. And but her dad was a Skye crofter, so she had this sort of double background, as it were. And she came to a point in her life where she wanted to investigate the other side of her heritage, and decided that going to visit her brother, who lives there in the story, was where to start. So that's how that came about. It was quite strange. I mean, when I say to people, oh, you know, they ask about your books, and you say, well, that one is set on the Isle of Skye and in the Middle East, and you can see people thinking, okay, you wouldn't naturally put these two settings together, but I hope it worked. It was a huge part of Rachel's story, this other side to her identity and what it meant to her, and trying to understand why her brother felt so at home there. You know, he had really sort of shunned his Scottish half and gone off and really gone fully native, if you like, in Israel, Palestine. And she was very conflicted herself about the situation she found there, and but also very aware that she was an outsider, and you know, she couldn't be too judgmental, but equally she had to reach a position that she was comfortable with, and a way of sharing it with other people. So that becomes her work as the books go on. That becomes what she focuses on.
Yeah, I'd been going to ask about sort of the research for your books, in particular to do with Israel and Palestine. The middle book of that trilogy, Settlement in particular, I found very thought-provoking. You know, it really looked at both sides of that story without saying this is right or this is wrong. It just presented both sides. So were your own trips to Israel, Palestine part of your research? Was it talking to your friends? What kind of things did you do?
Yeah, I mean, my friend was great. She couldn't believe it when I told her where I was setting the books, you know, and because although she loves her country, it infuriates her in equal parts as much as she loves it. But she was great for keeping me right. I could check all sorts of things with her. But my most recent visit was. And the one immediately before that were while I was writing the books. So I had an awareness that there was things I wanted to check out. And she regularly goes and does silent protests at the checkpoints on the wall, the notorious wall. And I went along with her just as an observer, just to get a feel for what that's like and how intimidating it is, and to see young conscripted, you know, soldiers and all that kind, just to get a feeling for what that would be like if it was part of your everyday life. But also, again, to try and give this balanced view. I wasn't writing a political thriller. I was writing a very personal story, and it was a personal reaction that I wanted to get across. But then they also, I mean, there is the saying, you know, that the personal is political. So in saying your personal view, it is making, with a small p, a political statement. It was really a case of I thought it was a story worth telling, and it was something that it would be good if more people were aware of. You hear about it on the television, but you might not necessarily know any of the background, as is the case with so many things that go on in the world. And it just lent itself perfectly to the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So changing the subject slightly then, so as I mentioned at the beginning, you have also written a children's novel under your alter ego of Anne McAlpine.
Yes.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was a surprise to me as much as anybody else that I wrote a children's book. I never planned to write for children, even though I'd spent my working life as a primary school teacher. I think that was part of it, actually. It was like, I've spent long enough with children, I'm not writing a book for them as well. But again, it's that thing I was alluding to before, but your brain sometimes just goes off without you. And it was while I was still teaching. It was while I was teaching in Skye, in the school in Portree, the main town on the island. And every year, primary 6 studied the Jacobites and Bonnie Prince Charlie. And every year when they were doing that, we took them on a coach to Inverness, 2.5 hours to 3 hours on a coach to Inverness, to go to the wonderful Culloden battlefield and visitor centre, which is the history centre for the battle and for the Jacobite cause. And so it duly happened. I was with the class, and off we went to Culloden. And the education centre at the visitor centre is wonderful, and the people that work there are just incredible. And they get you dressed up, teacher included, teachers and adult helpers all had to dress up, the kids. And they take you out onto the battlefield, they recreate the scene, they have some of your redcoats, some of your Highlanders.
Running around the heather.
Yes. And we were told that we were going to reenact part of the battle, and I was made a redcoat commander, and I was to shout fire for the cannons, and the Highlanders children would come rushing towards us. And it was very funny because I was so pathetic. I sort of went, fire, and the guy in charge from the education centre said, well, I'm sorry, cut, that was pathetic. Of course, the kids loved that.
That was hilarious.
So we had to do it again. But it was while we were doing that, and we were sort of in the zone and pretending to be the warriors, I had this idea. It just struck me, and I thought, wouldn't it be weird if a couple of the children found themselves transported back? So instead of going home on the coach to Skye, they were transported back to the time of the aftermath of the Battle of Culloden. I thought, that would be quite a good story, but I just shoved it at the back of my mind, but it just wouldn't go away. And in the end, I thought, maybe write a short story, or I'll write a couple of chapters, see if there's anything here. So I did, and I took it into school. I said it was that classic, it's a friend of mine is writing this. I'd like to read it to you to see, you know, ask primary six for an honest opinion. And they were like, oh, yeah, that's quite good. And so it became a thing I can't remember, say Thursday afternoon. I read them the next little bit that I'd been writing that week. And eventually I broke down and confessed and said, it's actually me that's writing this. And the kids were wonderful. And I picked their brains. I was able to say things like, you know, do you have a mobile phone? And if you did, what's the rules around that, you know, when you're 10 or 11 years old? So it was great. I mean, I was able to pick their brains for so many things. So in the end, yes, I wrote a time slip novel about 3 primary 7 friends finding themselves back at the aftermath of the Battle of Culloden. And it was their mission was to ensure that Prince Charlie didn't muddle up the history timeline and that events played out as they should, and that he was rescued and taken to France after the defeat at Culloden. So
that's great that you had people, you know, the right age to do your research with, if you like, and also to get that immediate feedback as well from the people who would be, you know, the children who'd be the right age to read it. So
captive audience.
Absolutely. So obviously the past few months have been rather strange, and if it wasn't for the past few months, you and I would be talking along at Jameson Gate in Portobello, but sadly that hasn't happened. But thanks to technology, we have been able to have a chat, which is great. But I'm just wondering, how has this period of lockdown affected your work? Have you found that you've had more time to write? Have you not been able to concentrate? What's it been like for you?
Yeah, a bit of both these really, and I like a lot of people, it's changed as time's gone on. At first I was that very thing, I thought, oh well, you know, I'll be able, because I work in isolation anyway, you know, it won't be a big deal. But I found it quite hard to concentrate, and felt quite trapped like a lot of people. I think it was the fact that the choice had been taken away. Before, you know, if I wanted to have a day up in Edinburgh with a friend, meeting a friend for lunch, I could do that. But suddenly it was like, no, so you could just get on with your writing. And I don't know whether it's just I'm contrary or whether everybody's brains works like that, you know, but when you're told, yes, you know, get on with it, you're sort of like, I will if I feel like it. So I did find my concentration. I read a lot, and I took a bit of a break, although Fulfilment did come out in May, which was, you know, in the height of lockdown. And I thought, well, I must just carry on with that and just see that through. Again, I did, like a lot of writers, wonder, and I think, is it insensitive to put a book out now? But again, I did a little straw poll around, you know, readers and people that get my emails and that kind of thing, and you know, my newsletters. And again, it was no, we want to read, you know, it's fine, you know.
Absolutely. A form of escapism at the time.
Yeah,
we all needed a bit of escapism.
It doesn't mention COVID, you know, so and then as time went on, I got back in the zone. I suppose you start to, like anything, you start to get used to this new normal, as everyone keeps calling it. So now I would say, yes, I'm back in the writing zone now, and it sort of, feels more or less normal. But yeah, it wasn't that straightforward to begin with.
So, well, if I could just end with what I suppose is a traditional question to ask an author, you know, do you have anything in progress just now? What work do you have in progress? Are you able to tell us about anything? Give us an idea.
I can give you an idea. So it's a completely new series, and it's not like the Skye series in the sense it's not going to be the same characters, same main characters going through all the books. There'll be a pair, you know, a male and female main character, and that'll be the main romance of the story, and it'll be a book each. It'll move on to a different couple, but you'll be able to, it'll be the same community, so you'll be able to revisit characters that you met in book 1 when you're reading book 2, and so on. And it's set in the Scottish borders, this one, which is where I live now. Totally different landscape to up north to Skye, but equally dramatic in its own way. So I'm working on the first book, very early days, but I'm working on the first book at the moment. So,
we shall look forward to that. Well, thank you very much, Anne, for chatting with me today. It's been great to hear more about your books and all the background. For people watching, if you would like to buy any of Anne's books, if you have a look at the Portobello Bookshop website, or if you're nearby, you can pop along. They're going to have a special page where you can order books from any of the authors who are taking part this weekend. And don't forget that Portobello Book Festival is on all of this weekend, and if you keep visiting the website, there will be new events coming up over the course of the weekend, which you can either watch as they go out live, or you can watch later on if it's not at a suitable time. So thank you very much, Anne.
Not at all. As I say, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.